My ex-wife's new husband took my seat at my son's wedding. His father can sit in the back, he said, while my ex clapped. When my son reached the altar, he didn't smile. He folded the paper, pointed at his stepfather, and said something that made everyone turn pale. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments what city you're watching us from. This story didn't begin on the wedding day. It began 20 years ago in a small kitchen with a woman looking at me like I was a mistake she had made and a 6-year-old boy sleeping in the next room without knowing his world was about to change forever. My name is Esteban. I'm 48 years old, and what I'm going to tell you is the story of the day they tried to erase me, the day they sent me to the back as if I didn't exist, and the moment my son, with a paper in his hand and a firm voice, showed everyone that I had existed every second of his life. Dulce and I got married young. I was 24, she was 22. Eduardo arrived the following year, and for a while we were what anyone would call a normal family. I worked in construction, long shifts, rough hands. I came home with dirty clothes and an exhausted body, but I showed up. I always showed up. The problem was that for Dulce, showing up wasn't enough. She wanted more, always more. A bigger house, a better car, a life I couldn't give her with what I earned back then. And I didn't blame her for wanting those things. What broke me inside was the way she told me, with that cold look, as if I wasn't enough, as if everything I did was never enough. When Eduardo was 6, Dulce told me she wanted to separate. There wasn't a big fight, there wasn't a dramatic moment. Just one night after dinner, she looked at me and told me she didn't want to continue, that she deserved something better, that the life we had wasn't what she had imagined. I sat in that kitchen chair for a long time, looking at the table, listening to Eduardo breathing from his room, thinking about what was going to happen to that boy who had no idea what he was about to lose. The divorce was fast. She kept the house. I went to a rented room that smelled like dampness and had a window that didn't close well. I started paying child support from the first month. I didn't fail a single time in 20 years. But they gave me 2 days a week to be his father. 2 days. And in those 2 days, I put in everything I had. I picked him up on Friday, took him to the park, helped him with homework, bought him the shoes he needed, even if it meant I ate rice with rice that week. There were Fridays I arrived for him just to make that boy feel his dad was present, that his dad hadn't left, that his dad would always choose him no matter what. What I didn't know was that someone was already working to replace me. When Eduardo was 9, Alvaro appeared in their lives. I found out through my mom, Rosa. She lived nearby and sometimes picked Eduardo up from school when I couldn't. One afternoon, she called me with that voice of hers when she has something important and doesn't know how to start. She told me, "Esteban, there's a new man in the house." I took a deep breath. I told her it was fine, that Dulce had the right to rebuild her life, that the important thing was Eduardo. And at that moment, I truly believed it. Alvaro had money, the kind of money I was never going to have with my hands full of cement, and he used it on my son. Expensive clothes, video games, outings, a bicycle that cost more than I earned in a whole month. And Eduardo, who was a child, who couldn't understand what was happening, his eyes started to shine for that man, and little by little, without me seeing it coming, something started to change. Eduardo started canceling weekends, first with small excuses, a birthday, an outing, an activity he had forgotten to tell me about. I didn't complain. I didn't want to be the father who fights for time. I wanted to be the father who understands, the father who doesn't complicate things, but every cancellation cost me something inside. Every Friday, the phone rang, and it was Dulce, saying Eduardo couldn't make it that weekend. Something inside me turned off a little more, like a candle no one notices is burning out until suddenly there's no more light. And even so, I kept going, I kept showing up, I kept paying, I kept being his father, even if I felt they were making him forget me slowly, with expensive gifts and busy weekends and a man with money who knew exactly what he was doing, because Eduardo was the only thing I wasn't willing to let go of. The only thing. And now, 20 years after that night in the kitchen, I was sitting near the exit of a church, looking at my son at the altar with that folded paper in his hand and an expression on his face that I hadn't ever, in 48 years of life, seen before. Eduardo was 12 the first time he told me Alvaro was like a dad to him. He didn't say it with bad intentions. He said it how kids say things, without a filter, without measuring the weight of the words. We were eating a burger on a Saturday afternoon, just the two of us, and out of nowhere he dropped it like that, looking out the window like it was something normal. I kept eating. I didn't say anything. I nodded slowly. I asked him if he liked the burger. I changed the subject so naturally he didn't even notice. But inside something broke in me at that moment. Not from anger, not from jealousy, from fear. The quietest fear that exists, the one that doesn't scream or hit. The one that simply settles in your chest and stays there breathing slowly, reminding you every night that you can lose something you love without anyone warning you. I kept showing up every weekend they let me. I kept paying every month without fail. And I kept watching how Alvaro built something with my son that I couldn't compete with using money, but that I try to make up for with presents. The problem is that presence doesn't always win against gifts when the one deciding is 12 years old. When Eduardo turned 15, Dulce called me to say they were throwing a big party, a celebration like the ones held in families that have the means. She told me I could go, that I had a spot on the list. But when I arrived that day, I saw my spot on the list was a table at the back of the garden, far from the stage where Alvaro had set up a microphone to give a speech about his son. His son, that's what he called him, in front of everyone, with a drink in his hand and that smile of a satisfied man. I was sitting at that back table with a glass of soda in my hand, listening to how the man who had been in Eduardo's life for 6 years spoke about him as if he had brought him into the world. As if the previous years didn't exist, as if I was a minor detail in my own son's story. My mom, Rosa, was sitting next to me that night. She squeezed my hand under the table without saying anything. That was all, but it was enough so I wouldn't get up and say what I had in my throat. I stayed quiet. I smiled when Eduardo searched for me with his eyes in the crowd. I clapped when he blew out the candles. And when the party ended, I drove back to my apartment. I sat in the dark and spent a long while without turning on the light. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to fight for the place that belonged to me, making scenes, nor complaining in public. I was going to keep being the father I'd always been, in silence, with actions, with presence. Because children grow up, and when they grow up, they see, and when they see, they understand. At least that's what I told myself to keep going. What I didn't know was what Alvaro was doing when I wasn't looking. I found out years later, much later, and when I knew, I understood that what that man had built wasn't a relationship with my son. It was a trap. Eduardo was 17 when he started distancing himself in a way that didn't seem natural anymore. It wasn't cancellations with small excuses anymore. It was silence, messages that took days to be answered, calls going straight to voicemail. And when we saw each other, there was something weird in his look, as if he had something to tell me, but didn't know how. One day, Dulce called me, not to talk about Eduardo, to tell me they were moving. Alvaro had bought a house in another city 4 hours from where I lived. She told me like someone reporting the weather. Without asking me, without considering what that meant for me, I told her that affected my time with Eduardo. She told me Eduardo was already 17 and could decide for himself who he wanted to be with. And there was the trap. Because a 17-year-old boy who has spent 8 years seeing a man with money make his life easy, who has spent 8 years hearing hints about the father who could never give him more, who has spent 8 years being molded slowly without anyone saying it out loud, that boy doesn't always decide with his heart. Sometimes he decides with what he was taught to value. I moved closer to them 6 months later. I left the job I had. I got a new one that paid less, but put me 40 minutes away from where my son lived. I rented a smaller apartment, adjusted everything, cut back on everything, because I wasn't going to let distance be the excuse to disappear from his life. And little by little, Eduardo started to come back. Not all at once. It was slow like everything important. First a call once in a while, then a visit on a Sunday, then a whole afternoon watching soccer in my apartment like when he was a kid. And on those afternoons, in those moments without noise, nor gifts nor speeches with a microphone, my son and I found each other again. I never asked him what had happened in those years of distance. I didn't want him to feel he had to choose. I didn't want to put him in the middle of anything. I just wanted to be there. I just wanted him to know his dad was still in the same place waiting, without holding grudges and without conditions. It was during one of those afternoons when he told me he had met Isabel. His eyes shined in a way I recognized immediately. That way eyes shine when you're talking about someone who changed something inside you. He talked to me about her for 2 hours, about how he had met her, about how she made him feel, that he believed she was the person he wanted to build something serious with. I listened to him with all my soul, and when he finished talking, I told him the only thing a father can say at that moment, that I was very happy for him, that he deserved someone who made him feel like that, and that when he was ready to introduce her to me, I'd be there. He introduced her to me 3 weeks later. Isabel was exactly what you expect when your son talks about someone with that light in his eyes, calm, direct, with a smile that didn't ask for permission. From the first moment, she treated me with respect, called me by my name, asked me things, looked at me when I spoke. I realized very quickly that this girl saw the real Eduardo. Not the Eduardo with expensive clothes and trips paid by Alvaro. The real Eduardo, the one who got nervous when talking about his dreams, the one who laughed loud at bad jokes, the one who called his grandma Rosa on Sundays without fail. 2 years later, Eduardo called me on a Tuesday morning. He told me he was going to propose to Isabel and asked if I could be with him when he went to buy the ring. I had to sit down, not because I was surprised he was getting married, but because he was asking me to be there, to be part of that moment, to go with him. After everything, after the years of distance, the cancellations, the tables at the back of the garden, the speeches with someone else's microphone, the moves without asking, the Fridays with $1 in my pocket eating rice, so he wouldn't lack anything. After all that, my son was calling me. I went with him. We spent a whole afternoon in 3 different jewelry stores until he found the ring. It wasn't the most expensive one. It was the one Isabel would have chosen herself if she'd been there. Eduardo knew at the moment he saw it. He took it, looked at it, and said, "This is it." We went out to the street and went to eat something. It was the best afternoon I'd had in years. What I didn't know was that while we were in that jewelry store, Alvaro was already making his moves for that day. He was already planning exactly how he was going to handle the wedding. He had already decided that day wasn't going to be Eduardo's day. It was going to be his day. Eduardo's proposal was on a Wednesday night. He called me early the next day with that voice people have when they just experience something that changed them inside. Isabel had said yes, without hesitating. She had started crying before he finished speaking. I laughed with him for 20 minutes on the phone. I don't remember the last time I had laughed like that. That week, everything seemed new. Eduardo called me often to tell me details, that they had already thought of a date, that Isabel wanted something intimate but beautiful, that they were looking for a place that wasn't too big or too cold. He asked my opinion. He included me in the conversations as if it were natural, as if it had always been like that. And I kept each of those calls as if they were something valuable, because they were. The problem started 3 weeks after the proposal. Dulce called Eduardo on a Sunday night, not to congratulate him, to tell him Alvaro wanted to talk to him, that he had a proposal, that it was important the 3 of them met that week. Eduardo told me almost without giving it importance. He told me it was probably to offer help with something for the wedding, that Alvaro always did that he liked showing up with big solutions when there was something important. I didn't say anything, but something in my stomach moved. They met the following Thursday. Eduardo called me that night after dinner. The voice wasn't the same as when he told me Isabel had said yes. It was a weird voice, quieter, like when someone receives something they don't know if they want. He told me Alvaro had offered to pay for the whole wedding. Everything, the venue, the catering, the flowers, the music, the photographer, the video, the details, absolutely everything. A check for $45,000 placed on the table like someone taking out a $20 bill to pay for a coffee. I stayed silent. Eduardo asked me what I thought. I told him it was his and Isabel's decision, that what mattered was that they were comfortable, that if they accepted, they should accept without feeling they owed anyone anything, and that if they didn't accept, that was fine too. What I didn't tell him was what I knew about those kinds of offers. Alvaro's money never came alone. It always came with something attached, an expectation, a silent debt, a form of control that wasn't signed on any paper, but that everyone understood perfectly. Eduardo and Isabel accepted, and from that week, Alvaro became the center of the wedding planning. At first it was subtle. He suggested things, proposed options, offered to make calls, to use his contacts to get better prices. Eduardo let him do it because it seemed like genuine help and because $45,000 generates a gratitude hard to ignore. But week by week the suggestions turned into decisions. Alvaro chose the venue because he knew the owner and got the best price. Alvaro chose the menu because he had experience with those kinds of events. The guest list started growing with names Eduardo didn't even recognize. People from Alvaro's circle, partners, acquaintances, people who were going to see the man who paid for the party more than the bride and groom. And my place in all that was getting smaller and smaller. They didn't tell me directly. There wasn't a conversation where someone sat with me to explain what was happening. It was more subtle than that. It was not being included in the planning calls. It was finding out about decisions from Eduardo 2 days after they were already made. It was arriving at a family meeting about the wedding and finding that the table where everything was discussed had Alvaro at the head and me in a chair behind that someone had pulled up at the end. One day, Eduardo called me to tell me Alvaro wanted to talk to me directly, just the two of us. I accepted. We met at a restaurant he chose. He arrived on time, well-dressed, with that confidence of men who have gone too long without anyone telling them no. He greeted me with his hand, looked at me how you look at something that doesn't quite fit in the right place, and sat down. He talked to me for 20 minutes about how much he loved Eduardo, about everything he had done for him, about the years he had been present when, according to his words, circumstances had made the presence of others difficult. He didn't look at me when he said that. He took a sip of water and kept talking. Then he got to the point. He told me that for the wedding it would be better if I kept a low profile, that he had invested a lot in that event and wanted it to be a tension-free celebration. That Dulce felt uncomfortable with certain dynamics, that the most important thing was for Eduardo and Isabel to be happy, and that for that it was necessary for everyone to take the place they belonged. I asked him with all the calm I could gather what place that was according to him. He looked at me and told me my place was that of just another guest. Not the father, not the man who had spent 20 years building a relationship with his son with 2 days a week and $1 in his pocket. Not the one who had left his job and moved cities so as not to lose him. Not the one who had gone to 3 jewelry stores on a Tuesday afternoon until finding the perfect ring. Just another guest. I paid my part of the bill, got up, shook his hand, and left. I didn't tell Eduardo anything that night. I didn't want to burden him with that before his wedding. I didn't want him to feel he had to get in the middle of anything. That was my decision. I was going to carry it alone, but that night, I called my mom, Rosa. I told her everything, every word of that conversation in the restaurant. Rosa listened to me without interrupting. When I finished, there was a long silence, and then she told me something I didn't fully understand at that moment. She told me, Esteban, save everything you can. Everything. I didn't ask her what she meant, but something in her voice made me think she knew something I still didn't know. The following weeks were the hardest of the whole planning. Alvaro raised the tone slowly. First, he suggested that at the ceremony the front row seats be for the closest family. And when Eduardo asked him what he meant, Alvaro already had the answer ready. Dulce, him, the uncles on her side, Isabel's grandparents. Eduardo called me that night a bit confused. He asked me how I felt about that. I told him I was fine, that what mattered was seeing him happy that day, and I believed it. I truly believed it. What I didn't know was that Alvaro was going to go much further than taking away my front row seat. It was 4 days before the wedding when Eduardo called me at night. He took a moment before speaking. I asked him if he was okay. He told me yes. He just wanted to know if I was going to be there on Saturday. I told him I'd be there, that nothing in the world was going to stop me. There was another silence, and then he told me, Dad, trust me that day. I didn't understand what he meant. I told him yes, that I trusted him, and we said goodbye. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stayed in the dark of my apartment thinking about that phrase. Trust me that day. What did that mean? What did Eduardo know that I didn't know? Or was it just a nervous son before his wedding telling his father everything was going to be fine? I didn't know until Saturday, until I saw the folded paper in his hand. Saturday dawned with a son that didn't ask for permission. One of those clear days that seemed designed for something important. The kind of morning you remember not for what you saw, but for what you felt when you opened your eyes and knew that day was going to be different from all the rest. I woke up early, earlier than necessary. I made myself a coffee, sat at the window, and spent a long while looking at the empty street without thinking about anything specific, just letting the day enter slowly. There was something weird in that morning silence. It wasn't peace, it was more like the calm before a big storm hits. When the air stops and the birds stop making noise and everything stays still in a way that isn't natural. I showered, put on the suit I had bought 3 weeks before. It wasn't expensive, it was the best I could afford at that moment. A dark suit, white shirt, a tie Eduardo had given me for a birthday and that I had saved for an occasion worth it. I put it on slowly in front of the mirror. I looked at myself a moment, thought about everything it had cost to reach that day, and left. The church was 40 minutes from my apartment. I arrived half an hour early because I wanted to be there before people arrived. I wanted to sit in peace, in silence, and live those minutes without noise before everything began. When I went in, the church was already being decorated with the final details. White and gold flowers in every row, ribbons on the ends of the seats, a soft light that came through the stained glass and painted the floor with colors. It was beautiful. It was exactly the kind of place Eduardo and Isabel would have chosen if they had chosen by themselves. I sat in the third row on the left side, the place for the groom's father. I was there about 10 minutes, just looking at the altar, breathing slowly, thinking about the first time I held Eduardo in my arms. Thinking about the afternoon, he learned to walk and fell 4 times before taking 3 steps in a row and laughed every time he felt like it was a game. Thinking about the day, I left him at the school gate for the first time, and he turned to look at me twice before going in. 20 years of moments kept somewhere in the chest that you don't know how to name, but that are always there. People started arriving first little by little, then in groups, families, friends, acquaintances. Isabel's side filled up fast with people greeting each other with long hugs and easy laughs. On the groom's side arrived faces I recognized and faces I didn't. People from Alvaro's circle who had nothing to do with Eduardo, but who took up space as if they'd been part of his life for years. My mom, Rosa, arrived 20 minutes before the ceremony started. She sat next to me, squeezed my arm without saying anything. I looked at her and saw she had a weird expression, not of sadness or nerves. It was more like the expression of someone waiting for something to happen that they know is going to happen. I asked her quietly if she was okay. She told me yes, that everything was going to be fine. Those words again. 10 minutes before the ceremony started, Dulce arrived. She walked in on Alvaro's arm with that confidence that comes from believing you own the place. Alvaro greeted people as he walked down the center aisle, as if he was the one getting married. Handshakes, pats on the back, smiles at a man who knows everyone is looking at him and likes it. Dulce wore a champagne-colored dress. She looked good. She looked like someone who had spent the week preparing for that moment. She saw me from afar. Our eyes met for a second, and she looked away immediately. Alvaro didn't look at me. They walked down the aisle, and when they reached the third row, the place where I was sitting with my mom, Alvaro stopped. He stood right in front of me. I looked at him. He looked at me, and then he did something I didn't expect. He didn't speak directly to me. He turned to the people sitting around, raised his voice a bit to make sure those nearby could hear, and said, "This place is for the groom's family, the close family." There was an uncomfortable moment of silence. Someone coughed. Someone else stopped talking mid-sentence. I didn't move. Then Alvaro turned to Dulce, who was next to him, and she, with a small and cold smile that I had seen before in other situations, said in a loud, clear voice so there would be no doubt, "His father can sit back there," and she pointed to the back of the church. I don't know how many seconds passed after that. I felt everything slow down. The noise of the people, the soft music playing in the background, the light from the stained glass. Everything stayed the same, but something in the air changed completely. 200 people, or at least the ones nearby who had heard, looked at me, some with pity, others with discomfort, those from Alvaro's circle with that expression of someone seeing exactly what they expected to see and finding it entertaining. My mom, Rosa, next to me stayed completely still. I stood up. I didn't say anything. I didn't complain. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't tell Alvaro everything I had kept inside since the conversation in that restaurant where he explained what my place was. I didn't tell Dulce what I thought of her. At that moment, I took my jacket, buttoned the bottom button of the jacket, and walked down the center aisle towards the back of the church with my back as straight as I could keep it. Every step was an effort, not because of pride, but because my legs were shaking and I didn't want it to show. I sat in the last row, near the door, the hard wooden seat, without flowers, without a ribbon on the end, the place where you sit when you arrive late or when you aren't part of anything happening inside. Rosa got up from the third row and came to sit with me. I looked at her. Her eyes were shining, but she wasn't crying. She took my hand and squeezed it hard. I told her in a very low voice that she didn't have to stay with me, that she could go to her place. She told me her place was wherever I was. We sat in silence, the two of us waiting. The music changed. People settled down. The murmurs died down until the church was left in that special silence that only exists when something important is about to start. Alvaro was in the front row with his jacket perfectly worn, with that posture of a man who got where he wanted to get, Dulce next to him, her back straight, her smile ready. And then the wedding march started. Isabel walked in first on her father's arm. She walked slowly down the aisle with a calm that made her look bigger than the place. She looked towards the altar with an expression that needed no explanation. Then Eduardo walked in alone, without anyone accompanying him. That wasn't in any program I'd seen. He hadn't talked about that with anyone. Eduardo simply walked in alone, walked down the aisle with a firm step, and when he reached the altar, he turned toward the guests. He didn't smile. He had an expression I had never seen on him before, serious, calm, but with something underneath that felt like a current of cold water under a still surface. He searched with his eyes among the people. He found me back there, near the exit. He stared at me for 4 or 5 seconds that felt much longer than that. And then he reached into his jacket's inner pocket, took out a folded paper, held it between his fingers without opening it yet, looked towards the altar, looked towards Alvaro in the front row, and took a deep breath once. Like someone who has been waiting months for a moment and finally has it in front of him. My mom, Rosa, next to me, squeezed my hand harder and whispered something so quietly I almost didn't hear it. She said, "Here he comes, Esteban." The priest began to speak. His voice filled the church with that calm men have who spend years standing in front of important moments. Words about love, about commitment, about what it means to decide to share your life with someone. Words that at another time would have reached inside me. But I wasn't listening to any of that. I had my eyes fixed on that paper Eduardo held between his fingers. He hadn't let it go since he walked up to the altar. He had it there folded, squeezed in one hand, while with the other he held Isabel's hand, as if that paper was part of the ceremony, as if it had always been planned for it to be there. Isabel looked at him from time to time with a calm expression. She knew something. That became clear to me at that moment. The bride knew exactly what her future husband had in that paper, and not only agreed, but was waiting for it just like him. There was no surprise on her face. There was calm. The calm of someone who completely trusts the person next to them. Alvaro was in the front row with his arms crossed, and that posture of a satisfied man he had brought since he entered the church. From time to time, he whispered something in Dulce's ear, and she nodded with a small smile. The two of them in their world, the two convinced that day belonged to them. I stayed in the back with my mom, Rosa, next to me, with my back straight and my hands still on my knees, because it was the only thing I could control at that moment. The priest spoke for several minutes. Readings, words, the usual ritual. And then came the moment that in many weddings is optional, but that Eduardo and Isabel had specifically asked to include in their ceremony. The moment of personal words. First, Isabel spoke. She turned to Eduardo with the bouquet in one hand and looked at him in a way that made several people in the church take out a tissue without anything having happened yet. She spoke about him with a simple and direct honesty that needed no decorations. She said she had chosen him not for what he had, but for who he was, that what she loved most about him was the way he talked about his father. She paused there and repeated that last part, the way he talked about his father. I felt something move in my chest. Alvaro uncrossed his arms. It was a small movement, almost unnoticeable, but I saw it from the back because I'd spent the whole ceremony looking forward with an attention I hadn't given to anything in a long time. Then it was Eduardo's turn. He turned towards the guests instead of towards Isabel. That was the first moment something in the church changed. It's not what you expect. You expect the groom to look at his bride when he speaks. But Eduardo looked towards the people, towards all those rows full of people who had come to see his wedding, and started speaking with a voice that didn't tremble. He said before saying his vows to Isabel, he needed to say something, that there was something he couldn't let pass that day without naming it, that there was something he had spent months waiting for the right moment to say, and that there was no more right moment than that. The church went completely still. That kind of silence that isn't empty, but the exact opposite, full of people holding their breath at the same time. Eduardo lowered his eyes to the paper, unfolded it slowly, and before reading looked up and searched for something among the people. I saw him scan the rows with his eyes from the altar. He passed over the front row, passed over the center rows, kept going back until he found me there in the back, near the exit, in the worst seat in the whole church. He looked right at me, and for the first time since he had stepped up to the altar, he smiled. It wasn't a big smile, it was small, brief, but it was the smile I knew, the same from when he was a kid, and did something he was proud of and searched for me with his eyes to make sure I had seen it. I felt something fill up that had been empty for hours. Then Eduardo lowered his eyes to the paper and started reading. He started talking about childhood, about concrete memories, specific ones, with names and places and details that only exist in the memory of someone who truly lived those things. The park they went to on Saturdays when it rained, the bad jokes they told under a tree waiting for the rain to stop, the soccer afternoons in a small apartment that smelled of coffee, the new shoes that appeared every time he needed them. Even if he never knew as a child what those shoes cost someone. Several people in the church started wiping their eyes. Alvaro stayed still in the front row, but his arms were no longer crossed. They were resting on his knees, and his body leaned slightly forward, like someone listening to something they didn't expect to hear and doesn't yet know if they should worry. Dulce had a frozen smile. Eduardo kept reading. He talked about the hard years, about the weekends that were canceled, and how his father never complained, about the times as a child he didn't understand why his dad didn't live in the same house, and the times as an adult he understood too well why that had happened. He talked about a move, about a job left behind, about a smaller apartment in a new city, about a man who cut back on everything he had to be 40 minutes away from his son. Several people turned towards the back of the church. They looked at me. I was looking at Eduardo and didn't take my eyes off him. Then Eduardo took a long pause, folded the paper in half, lowered it a moment, and looked up at the front row, towards Alvaro. He stared at him for 2 or 3 seconds that, in that silence, seemed much longer, and said there was something else he wanted to share that day, that there was something he had kept for months because he needed the right moment, that this was that moment, that in that place, in front of the people he loved most, he needed everyone to know one thing. He put his free hand in his pants pocket, took out his phone, unlocked it calmly. He searched for something on the screen, and then looked towards where my mom, Rosa, was, next to me, at the back of the church. Rosa sat up straight. Eduardo said her name out loud. He asked if she could read out loud what was on that phone. Rosa already had hers in her hand. She had had it in her hand since before the ceremony started. Now I understood. That's why she had arrived with that weird expression. That's why she had told me her place was wherever I was. That's why she had squeezed my hand when Eduardo took out the paper. She had known everything long before I did. Rosa stood up. 200 people looked at her. Alvaro looked at her, and Rosa, with that voice of hers you wouldn't expect for a woman her age, but that when she speaks seriously fills any space, started reading a conversation out loud, a text message conversation between Alvaro and Dulce, dated 7 years ago. The first of those messages said something that made the air in that church change completely. It said, with the exact words Rosa read, without rushing, without drama, with that cold calm the truth has when it finally comes out, that Alvaro had transferred money to someone, that this someone had clear instructions, and that the goal was to make sure Eduardo stopped wanting to see his father. Rosa lowered the phone, looked at Alvaro, and the whole church fell into a silence I hadn't heard like that in my whole life. The silence lasted several seconds. Those seconds that aren't measured in time, but in weight, in the amount of things that fit inside them, without anyone saying anything. 200 people still, the music off, the light from the stained glass falling on the altar where Eduardo was still standing with the paper in one hand and the phone in the other, and Alvaro in the front row. Pale, not completely, not all at once. It was a paleness that arrived slowly, like when blood decides to retreat from a place because there's no reason to be there anymore. I saw the exact moment he understood what was happening. I saw how his jaw tensed, how his hands, which were resting on his knees, closed slowly into a fist he tried to hide by resting them differently. Dulce didn't move. She stayed exactly the same. Her back straight, her eyes forward, but the smile had disappeared completely, and in its place was an expression I knew well. It was the expression she made when she was calculating, when her mind was working fast, looking for a way out. Rosa was still standing next to me with the phone in her hand. Eduardo looked at her from the altar and nodded slowly, and Rosa kept reading. The second message was from Dulce, replying to Alvaro. Rosa read every word without rushing, with that calm that makes things way more than if you shouted them. Dulce confirmed to Alvaro that she had talked to the person, that she agreed, that she knew exactly what to tell Eduardo and when to tell him so it would work. Someone in the church let out a sound. It wasn't crying. It was something between surprise and outrage. That sound people make when they hear something they know is real because it's too specific to be made up. The third message was a transfer confirmation for $1,000. Rosa read the number out loud and let it float in the church air without adding anything. For $1,000 to pay someone to take charge of working an 11-year-old boy's mind, to plant doubts about his father, to tell him versions of stories that weren't true, to make him believe slowly and carefully that the man who had always chosen him wasn't the man who deserved his time. I felt something in my chest break and put itself back together at the same time. Not from anger, from something more complicated than that, something that doesn't have a clean name. The mix of confirming what a part of you already suspected with the pain of hearing it said out loud in front of 200 people on your son's wedding day. Eduardo lowered the paper, put the phone in his pocket, and spoke directly, without reading, with his own voice. He said he was 11 when he started hearing things about his father, small at first, comments that seemed casual, stories told a certain way that made him doubt. Questions planted carefully that always led him to the same conclusion, that his father hadn't been there when he should have, that his father had failed in ways that he was too young to verify, that the man who arrived on weekends with $15 in his pocket and took him to the park in the rain was less than he seemed. He said for years he believed it, that he didn't believe it all or always, but enough sank in, enough settled somewhere inside him, and changed the way he looked at his father without fully realizing what was happening. He said the person they had paid to do that job was someone who had been close to him during those years, someone he trusted, someone who used that trust with precision and patience for a long time. He said he wasn't going to say that person's name that day, that it was something he was going to handle in private, but that Alvaro and Dulce's part he couldn't handle in private because what they had done wasn't just against him, it was against his father, against a man who had never failed, who had never stopped showing up, who had never used his son as a coin for anything, and that this man deserved the truth to be said out loud in the place where Alvaro had decided to humiliate him in front of everyone. There was a movement in the front row. Alvaro stood up, not suddenly, carefully, with the composure of someone who still believes they can handle the situation if they speak with the right voice and put on the right face. He stood up, fixed his jacket, and started to say something. I didn't hear the first words well, because several people in the church started moving and whispering at the same time. Eduardo looked at him from the altar. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't interrupt him rudely. He simply waited for Alvaro to finish his first sentence, and then said with a calm that was more powerful than any shout that he hadn't finished. Alvaro closed his mouth. Eduardo said there was one more thing. He reached into his jacket's inner pocket and took out something I hadn't seen before. It wasn't the folded paper. It was a small white envelope. He held it up for people to see and then opened it. Inside was a piece of paper with numbers. Eduardo explained that for the last 8 months he had been reviewing things, old conversations, dates, transactions. With Isabel's help, who worked in accounting, he had tracked something he hadn't understood at the time, but that now made complete sense. Alvaro had used money from a joint account he had with Dulce to make that $4,000 transfer, an account that back then Dulce also managed under household expenses, a household that included Eduardo. In other words, part of the money that had been used to manipulate Eduardo had come from funds that in theory were for his well-being. They had financed it with his own well-being. Someone in the church said something out loud that I couldn't hear well, but that caused a chain reaction of murmurs that filled the space in seconds. Isabel, next to Eduardo, closed her eyes a moment and opened them again. The priest, who had remained still and silent all that time with an expression that revealed nothing, lowered his head slightly. Dulce stood up. She started to say something. Her voice came out louder than I think she intended. She said that wasn't true, that they were taking things out of context, that messages could be interpreted in many ways, that she had always done what was best for Eduardo, and that no one in that church had the right to judge her without knowing the whole story. Eduardo let her speak. He waited, and when Dulce finished, he said only one thing. He said the messages had a date, time, and full name, that the bank transfer had a confirmation number, that Isabel had prepared a document with everything organized, that it was available for anyone who wanted to see it, that it wasn't interpretation, it was a record. Dulce sat down. Alvaro was still standing, but he didn't look like the same man who had entered that church 2 hours before with his jacket perfectly worn and greetings ready. He looked smaller, not physically, but in that way people shrink when the space they took up was built on something that no longer exists. Eduardo folded the paper, put it back in the envelope. The envelope went back in his pocket, and then he did something no one expected. He stepped down from the altar, walked down the center aisle, past the front row, without looking at Alvaro or Dulce. He passed the center rows, kept walking towards the back, towards me. I stood up without thinking, without deciding to. My body simply did it before my brain processed what was happening. Eduardo reached where I was, looked at me, and told me in a low voice, just for me, with that voice I had heard for the first time in a hospital room 28 years ago, to forgive him for the years it took him to see what had always been there, to forgive him for having doubted, to forgive him for letting them change his view without defending himself. I couldn't say anything. I hugged him. I hugged him how you hug someone when you have 20 years of things kept inside, and suddenly a place opens up where they can all fit. My mom, Rosa, next to me, cried silently with one hand resting on both our backs. Behind us, at the back of the church, I heard footsteps. Alvaro walking toward the exit. Dulce behind him, without saying anything, without looking back, leaving her own sons wetting through the back door, near the seat where they had sent me to sit. Alvaro and Dulce left through that door, and the church stayed silent for a few more seconds. Not the tense silence from before, it was another type of silence. The one left after something heavy falls to the floor and the noise fades, but the air still remembers the impact. People looked at each other, some with red eyes, others with that expression of someone who just processed something that needs time to fully settle. Eduardo pulled away from the hug slowly. He looked me in the eyes for a moment. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. He had said everything he had to say, and he had said it the only way that mattered. Out loud, with proof, in front of everyone. He squeezed my arm once and turned around to walk back to the altar. I watched him walk away down that aisle that 2 hours before I had walked in the opposite direction with my back straight and my legs shaking. I watched him walk up the altar steps. I watched him stand in front of Isabel, who was waiting for him exactly where he had left her, with the bouquet in her hands and that calm of hers that at that moment seemed the most powerful thing I had seen all day. Isabel looked at him and smiled at him. Not a polite smile or a relieved one. A smile of someone who fully trusted the person she chose and just saw confirmed that trust was well placed. The priest, who had remained at the altar all that time, with a composure I commend, waited for Eduardo to be standing in front of him. He waited for the murmur among the people to die down on its own. And when the church was still again, he said something I didn't expect him to say. He said in many years of celebrating marriages, he had never witnessed anything like this. that what had just happened in that church was exactly what all the readings he had given at all the weddings of his life talked about. That true love wasn't just the one declared between two people getting married. It was also the one a father built in silence for 20 years without asking for recognition, and the one a son found the courage to name when it mattered most. There was applause, not from 2 or 3 people, from the whole church. I was in the back with my mom, Rosa, and I didn't know where to put my hands or my gaze or the things I had inside that didn't fit in any specific place. Rosa squeezed my arm and told me quietly to sit down, to breathe, that it was all over now. I sat down, breathed, and listened to the rest of the ceremony from the back of that church. From the worst seat in the place, with wet eyes and something in my chest, I took a while to identify, because it had been so long since I felt it that I almost didn't recognize it. It was relief, clean relief, without conditions, without buts, without the shadow of something pending to make it dirty. Eduardo and Isabel exchanged their vows. His were short, direct, without paper. This time he said them from memory, looking in her eyes, and every word sounded like something he had thought a lot before saying. He told her he chose her not just for what she gave him, but for what she had taught him to see, that thanks to her he had learned to look at his own story without fear, that the person he was that day had a lot of her inside. Isabel was crying when he finished, smiling and crying at the same time, like you only can when something touches you somewhere very deep inside. When the priest declared them married and Eduardo kissed her, the church reacted with that warmth full places have when everyone feels the same thing at the same time. Applause, laughs, someone shouting something from one of the center rows that I didn't understand, but that made those nearby laugh. And I clapped from the back with the hands that had shaken all morning and that were now still. The ceremony ended, and people started moving towards the exit for the next part of the celebration. In that movement of people, of greetings and hugs, and the noise that returns when something formal ends, something interesting happened. People came towards the back. Not everyone, but many. People I didn't know, Eduardo's friends, Isabel's relatives, even some of the guests who had arrived from Alvaro's circle and who now had a completely different expression than the one they brought when they walked in. They came to greet me, to shake my hand, to tell me things. Some brief, just a handshake and a look, others with words I didn't expect. An older man I didn't see told me he had a son and hoped his son would someday do half of what Eduardo had done. A woman who had been crying since the speech hugged me, without saying anything, and I didn't know what to do with that hug. But I accepted it. One of the men who had arrived with Alvaro, one of his partners or acquaintances, approached me at the very end. He looked right at me. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he reached out his hand and said what he had heard today made him think about things he'd rather not analyze in front of me. I shook his hand. I didn't ask him what he meant. I didn't need to know. When the church was almost empty, Eduardo came to find me. He came with Isabel on his arm, and both had that bright expression people have in the first hours of something they know will last. They looked light, as if they had left something heavy at the altar and walked out of there with empty hands. Eduardo told me he wanted me at the head table at the reception, not as a favor, not as compensation for what had happened before. He said it as something natural, as the only option that made sense. I told him I'd be there. Isabel took my arm on the side Eduardo wasn't on, and the 3 of us walked out of the church together. Outside, the sun was still the same as in the morning, the same one that didn't ask for permission, but it felt different touching it, as if the sun itself was something else when you walk out of a place having left inside something you carried for a long time. My mom, Rosa, was waiting for us on the steps. When she saw the 3 of us come out together, she put a hand to her mouth, closed her eyes a second, opened them, and looked at us with that expression older people have when they see something they waited a long time for finally arrive. Eduardo stepped away from us a moment to greet the photographers and organize the photos outside. Isabel went with him. Rosa and I stayed alone on the steps. I asked her since when she knew about the messages. She looked at me, told me Eduardo had called her 8 months ago, had asked if she remembered things from that time, that they had talked several times, that in one of those conversations she had told him something she kept for years and never really knew whether to tell him or not. I asked what it was. She told me years ago when Eduardo was 11 and started distancing himself, she had seen something. She had been at Dulce's house, picking Eduardo up one afternoon, and had accidentally overheard a phone conversation. Not completely, fragments, but enough to understand Dulce was coordinating something with someone, that there was money involved, that it had to do with Eduardo and my relationship with him, that at the time she hadn't said anything because she had no proof, because she didn't want to cause harm without being sure, because she was afraid of being wrong and breaking something that could still fix itself. But she had saved on her phone the only 2 messages Dulce had sent her that same week, where without realizing it she revealed parts of what was happening. She had saved them without knowing what for, on instinct, because of that thing mothers have of keeping what might be useful, even if they don't know when. 8 months ago, Eduardo had asked her if she had anything from that time, and she had sent him those messages. Eduardo had taken them as a starting point. Isabel had done the rest of the tracking work, and together they had built for 8 months what was said out loud in that church that day. I just looked at Rosa. I asked her why she hadn't told me anything. She looked at me with that usual calm of hers and told me, because Eduardo had asked her not to, that he wanted to be the one to tell me, that he wanted me to hear it from his mouth at the moment he chose, in the way he thought was right, that he had planned it for the wedding from the beginning. I felt something weird at that moment, something that took me a while to name. It wasn't surprise, it was more like recognition. The feeling of seeing someone you know deeply do something completely consistent with who they are. Eduardo had waited for the most important moment, the most public one, the one that couldn't be undone later, the one that would be burned into the memory of everyone there. He hadn't done it out of revenge. He had done it so it would be clear, so there wouldn't be an alternative version later, so no one could say it was a misunderstanding or an exaggeration or something taken out of context in a private conversation. He had done it at the wedding, because the wedding was where Alvaro had decided to land his last blow, and Eduardo had decided that same stage would be the place where everything was known. Rosa took my hand, told me to go enjoy the reception, that I'd spent enough time near exits, that today my place was up front. The reception hall was 15 minutes from a church. Alvaro had chosen it himself, one of those places that have a name in the city. High ceilings, large windows, tables with white linens and flower centerpieces that cost more than I made in a week when Eduardo was a kid. The kind of place that says out loud that whoever paid for it has money and wants everyone to know it. I arrived with Rosa in my car. When we walked into the hall, there were already quite a few people inside. The noise was still soft. People arriving and settling in and finding their seats and greeting each other with that particular energy receptions have before the night takes its own rhythm. There is instrumental music playing in the background, waiters walking around with trays, everything perfectly organized, everything paid for by Alvaro who wasn't there. I searched with my eyes for the head table from the entrance. It was the longest in the hall, placed in the center with a direct view of the small dance floor and the stage where there would be live music later. Eduardo and Isabel were already there welcoming the first guests, greeting, holding hands with that ease people have when they're exactly where they want to be. Eduardo saw me walk in, raised a hand from the head table. It wasn't a big gesture, he just raised his hand, but it was enough for several of those nearby to follow his gaze and see me walk in. I felt those looks, but this time they were different from the ones in the church. They weren't of pity or discomfort. They were of recognition. I walked to the head table. My place was marked with a card to Eduardo's right, the place that belongs to the groom's father since weddings have existed and someone decided the order mattered. I sat down. Rosa sat next to me, and for the first time all day I breathed without having to remind myself to do it. The first minutes at the table were quiet. Isabel and Eduardo finished greeting the last guests and sat down. Isabel leaned towards me and told me quietly she was very glad I was there, without drama, with that naturalness of hers that made everything she said sound exactly how she felt it. I told her me too, and I meant in a way that went far beyond sitting at that table in that hall that night. Dinner began, and then something I didn't expect happened. One by one, throughout the night people approached that table, not just to congratulate the newlyweds, to talk to me. The first was a man around 50 who turned out to be Isabel's uncle. He introduced himself, shook my hand, and told me he had been hearing about me since Isabel had met Eduardo, that his niece had told him things, that he was glad to put a face to the story. I asked him what story. He told me the story of a father who never left, even when they pushed him to do it. I didn't know what to say. I nodded and thanked him. Then came a college friend of Eduardo's, a girl around 25 who sat in the empty chair next to me for a moment and told me Eduardo talked about me always, that in the college years, when Eduardo had already reconnected with me, he mentioned me often, that there was a time a group of friends were talking about their fathers, and Eduardo had said something she never forgot. I asked her what he had said. She told me Eduardo had said his dad was the kind of man you don't fully appreciate until you grow up enough to understand what it takes to be like that. I had to take a moment after that. I asked for a glass of water and drank it slowly, looking at the empty dance floor. Rosa, next to me, did that thing of hers of not saying anything, but being completely present. Her way of keeping company, which I had learned to recognize since I was a kid, didn't need words, just being there. Halfway through dinner, when the atmosphere was warmer and the music had gone up a bit, and people were at that pleasant point of the night where everything flows better, Eduardo stood up with a glass in his hand. He asked for attention. The hall lowered its volume until it was quiet. Eduardo spoke briefly, thanked those who had come. He said a few words about Isabel that made her laugh and blush at the same time, and then said he wanted to do one thing before the night continued. He looked at me, said there was something that should have happened at the ceremony and couldn't happen because of the circumstances everyone knew. He said he wanted to fix that. He turned to the DJ who was on the side of the hall and nodded. The music that was playing in the background stopped, and another one started. A slow song you recognize before identifying it. The kind your body recognizes before your mind does. Eduardo stepped down from the stage, walked to where I was sitting, and held out his hand to me. He told me, at weddings the groom's father and the groom danced together, that this dance was his with me, that they had planned it from the beginning and nothing that had happened that day was going to take it away from him. I stared at his outstretched hand for a second. Just one. I got up, and we danced. I'm not a good dancer. I never have been. Eduardo isn't either. The two of us moving on that floor with more intention than technique, which made several people laugh fondly from the tables. But 20 seconds, and I didn't care if we were doing it right or wrong anymore. I didn't care anymore about anything that had happened that morning. The seat in the back, Dulce's voice, Alvaro's look, the years of cancellations, the tables in other people's gardens, the Fridays with $15 in my pocket. All of that was still real. It would always be real, but at that moment it didn't take up space. At that moment, only that dance floor existed, that song and my son with his hand on my shoulder dancing clumsily at his own wedding. People clapped from the tables. Rosa cried openly and did nothing to hide it. Isabel watched us from the head table with her hands clasped under her chin and a smile that took up her whole face. When the song ended, Eduardo hugged me again on the floor in front of everyone and whispered something in my ear that I'll keep for the rest of my life and that I won't repeat here because there are things that only belong to the two of us. What I can say is that when we pulled apart and I went back to my chair, something had changed in me in a way I knew was permanent. It wasn't happiness exactly. It was something more solid than that. It was the feeling that 20 years hadn't been in vain. The night went on. The music got louder. People danced, the wine flowed, conversations mixed with the laughs and the particular noise of a hall full of people having a good time. But at some point that night, when it was already late and the reception started to slowly dissolve, something came to me that changed the way I understood everything that had happened that day. One of Alvaro's partners, the same one who had approached me in the church to shake my hand without saying much, looked for me in the hall. He sat next to me at a moment I was alone, with a glass in my hand, watching Eduardo dance with Isabel on the floor. He introduced himself, told me his name, told me he'd been doing business with Alvaro for 6 years, and then told me what he had heard in that church hadn't surprised him as much as it should have. I asked him what he meant by that. He told me Alvaro had a way of operating, that he used money as an instrument of control in everything he touched, businesses, relationships, family, that he himself had witnessed situations that now, with what he had heard today, he saw with different eyes. He told me he was going to review certain things when he went back to the office on Monday. He didn't explain more. He got up, shook my hand, and left. I kept thinking about what he had just told me, that Alvaro had a whole world outside that church, a world of businesses, of contracts, of people who trusted him with real money, and that what was said out loud that day wasn't going to stay just in that hall. Things said in public in front of 200 people don't stay in the place they're said, they travel. And that night, while I danced clumsily with my son at his wedding, those words were already traveling. The wedding night ended late. One of those nights you don't want to end, not because you're afraid of what comes next, but because what's happening is so good you want to stretch it, stay inside a bit longer, make the minutes longer than they are. When the hall started emptying out and the waiters began clearing the tables and the music lowered until it almost disappeared, Eduardo and Isabel said goodbye to the last guests holding hands. I watched them from where I was sitting with Rosa, both tired and happy with that particular tiredness that only comes from having lived something that really matters. Eduardo came to say goodbye to me before leaving. He gave me a long hug, unhurried, one of those hugs that aren't a goodbye, but a beginning of something. He told me he'd call me on Monday. I told him I'd be there. Isabel kissed my cheek and told me welcome to the family, with that naturalness of hers, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world, as if there were no other possible option. I watched them walk out of the hall, holding hands, and stayed a moment longer sitting in silence with Rosa before getting up. She looked at me and asked how I was. I told her the truth. I told her I didn't exactly know, that too much had happened in a single day to process it all at once, that there were parts that still hurt, even if the outcome had been good. That pain and relief could live together in the same place, and that night both were in there inside me, without asking permission. Rosa nodded. She told me that was exactly what I should feel, that healing wasn't to stop feeling, it was feeling everything together and staying on your feet. I drove Rosa home that night. The drive was quiet. Few people on the streets at that hour, the city lights passing by the windows in silence. Rosa fell asleep in the seat before we arrived. I looked at her at a stoplight. My mom, the woman who had kept 2 messages on her phone for years without knowing what for, out of pure instinct because of that thing of hers of keeping what might be useful even if she doesn't know when. Thanks to that, partly, my son had been able to tell the truth out loud in front of 200 people. Small things, gestures that seem insignificant, sometimes are the ones that change everything. I dropped her off at her door, walked her inside, and when I closed the door to her house and went back to my car, I sat for a moment in the dark before starting it. I thought about Alvaro, not with anger, more with that cold curiosity that comes from thinking about how people's decisions build them up or destroy them without them seeing it coming. Alvaro had spent years building an image, the successful man, the one with money, the one who can walk into any place and take whatever space he wants because he has the means to back it up. The one who pays $45,000 for a wedding and thinks that gives him the right to decide who sits where. And in one morning, in less than an hour, in front of 200 people that included his own partners and acquaintances, all of that had crumbled. Not because someone had attacked him, but because the truth had simply taken the space that had always belonged to it. What happened after the wedding, I found out in parts. During the following weeks, the partner who had approached me in the hall that night was serious when he said he was going to review certain things. 2 weeks after the wedding, Eduardo told me a rumor had spread in Alvaro's business circle that something important had come to light at a wedding, that details were circulating, that several of his partners had started asking questions Alvaro didn't have clean answers for. One of his most important contracts, a partnership that had been standing for 4 years, dissolved a month after the wedding. There were no public statements, there was no newspaper scandal, it was quieter than that. It was the kind of consequence that happens when people who handle serious money decide they don't want to be near someone whose way of operating was exposed like that. Money walks away in silence, and that for a man like Alvaro was worse than any public scandal. With Dulce, the story was different. Eduardo told me, she had called him 3 days after the wedding, that they'd had a long and difficult conversation, that Dulce had tried to defend herself first, then explain, then minimize, that Eduardo had listened without interrupting, and that when she finished, he had told her only one thing. That he wasn't calling to judge her, that he was calling to tell her he still loved her, because she was his mother, and that wasn't going to change, but that their relationship was going to be different from now on, that there were things that couldn't be ignored. That trust isn't recovered with a conversation, but with time and actions, and that if she wanted to build something different with him, he was willing to try, but that depended completely on her. Dulce had cried a lot on that call. Eduardo told me it hadn't been easy hearing her cry, that no matter how much you know what someone did, hearing your mother cry never stops costing you something inside. I told him that spoke well of him, that the ability to feel someone's pain, even if that someone hurt you, wasn't weakness. It was the exact opposite. He looked at me and told me he had learned that from me, that he had seen me do it for 20 years, show up without a grudge, without using pain as a weapon, simply keep being his father without turning every wound into a reason to pull away or to cause harm. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything. Sometimes silence is the only response that doesn't take weight away from what was just said. My life after the wedding changed in ways that from the outside might seem small, but to me were everything. Eduardo called me often, not out of obligation, because he wanted to. He told me things, asked my opinion, included me in decisions I didn't even know existed before. Isabel texted me sometimes just to tell me something funny that had happened for no special reason, the way you write to someone who is already part of your daily life. Rosa and I started having dinner together on Sundays. Something we did when I was a kid, and that, without either of us planning it, happened again with the same naturalness as before. I arrived at her house. She already had something on the stove. We sat down, ate slowly, and talked about anything, about Eduardo, about Isabel, about what had happened that week. About old memories that came up on their own in the conversation, like they always do when you're with people you feel at home with. One Sunday, eating dinner with Rosa, she asked me how I felt about everything that had happened. Not with the wedding specifically, with everything, with the 20 years, with the whole journey from that night in the kitchen, when Dulce told me she wanted to separate until that Sunday, sitting there with a plate of hot food and my son married and happy. I stayed thinking about the question for a moment. I told her if I could change anything about those 20 years, I probably wouldn't. She looked at me like she didn't quite believe me. I explained. I told her the hard years had taught me things I wouldn't have learned any other way, that the Fridays with $1 had taught me what really matters when there's nothing left but who you are, that the cancellations had taught me to show up without needing to be recognized for it, that the tables at the back of other people's gardens had taught me the place you take up in someone's life isn't measured by the seat they give you, but by what you built when no one was clapping. The seat near the exit where they sent me to sit that Saturday morning was the same seat from where I saw my son search for me with his eyes before telling the truth out loud, that if they had put me in the front row that day, I wouldn't have seen his face when he found me in the crowd. I wouldn't have seen that small smile, the one I recognized from when he was a kid and did something he was proud of and searched for me to make sure I'd seen it. Rosa looked at me for a long moment and then said I'd always been stubborn, but that stubbornness was the best thing I had. I laughed. It was a clean laugh, the kind that comes out on its own, the kind that doesn't need anything before, anything after. 20 years of sacrifice hadn't given me wealth or recognition, or any of the things the world hands to those who win fast and loud. They had given me something Alvaro, with all his money, was never going to be able to buy or take from anyone. They had given me my son back, and that, at the end of it all, was the only thing that had always mattered.